tall was Goliath? The answer might surprise you. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. And last week we had a video talking about the House of David series, so I thought I would follow it up with a little discussion on David's main nemesis. Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath, right? We even have it in our vernacular today to describe anytime a couple of people go up against a company or an underdog team goes up against the number one seed, right? It is a David and Goliath story. We know Goliath is the big guy, David is the little guy wins. But how tall actually was Goliath? What does the Bible say? Well, it is definitely not as clear as you would think. Believe it or not, there is actually no passage in Scripture that calls Goliath a giant. We read that in, we assume that, and there are reasons for why we do, but there is nothing in Scripture that ever says Goliath the giant, or the giant Goliath. He is said to have come from the town of Gath, where giants were known to be from. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 25, there is a mention of a man of, quote, great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So there were big dudes that came from that area, but Goliath is never specifically said to be a giant. Now, I think given the description of his size, and particularly the armor that he wore and the weapons that he wielded, the implication is that he was much larger than the average person. But how tall was he exactly? Well, 1 Samuel chapter 17 says that he was 6 cubits and a span. At least that's what you will read in many English versions. Now, that doesn't help most people today because we don't use cubits and spans. A cubit was an ancient method of measuring and is often said to have been 18 inches roughly. It would describe the length from the tip of the elbow on a man to the tip of his middle finger. So that whole thing, tip of the middle finger down to the tip of the elbow, that was considered by many to be a cubit. And then a span would be from the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger when spread out like that. And that is roughly 9 inches. So doing a little bit of quick math, 6 cubits, 6 times 18 is 108. Add in 9 inches for the span, that's 117. So we have him as being 117 inches tall. Divide that by 12 to get feet, and you get 9.75 or 9 feet, 9 inches. So that's what you're going to hear in a lot of churches for the height of Goliath, just under 10 feet. When I was a kid, I could swear I remember being told he was over 12 feet. Not sure where anyone got that measurement from, but 9 feet, 9 inches is the general assumption. But there are actually a couple problems with this, and they take the argument in opposite directions for Goliath's height. First problem, there were multiple cubits in the ancient world, and they could range anywhere from about 13 inches on the short side, so just over a foot, to over 3 feet, almost 4 feet. Basically, every ancient culture had a different way of measuring the cubit. Now, most of them settle roughly around 20 inches, but we don't actually know which cubit is being referenced here. So that could potentially add even more height to Goliath. Except, there's one other problem we have to talk about, and that's that there is a textual issue when it comes to this particular verse that describes Goliath as 6 cubits and a span. Because while the Masoretic text records it as such, pretty much every other source we have says something different. The Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, so this would have been the Bible that Jesus, the disciples, the New Testament writers would have used and been familiar with. Josephus, the first century historian from around the time of Jesus, and also the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are some of our oldest manuscripts of the biblical text. All 3 of those witnesses say 4 cubits and a span for Goliath, rather than 6 cubits and a span. So that would bring his height, using the roughly 18-inch cubit, down to 6 feet 9 inches, rather than 9 feet 9 inches. So this is why you may have heard people say that Goliath was not quite as tall as what many churches will say. And that's not some liberal argument to try to deny the supernatural elements of the Bible or something like that. It's just looking at history and seeing different cubit measurements. And it's looking at the textual tradition, which has several arguments in favor of the smaller number. Now, the average height of a guy today in the world is roughly 5 feet 7 inches. And our best guesses for the average height of a guy in the ancient world is roughly about the same. A lot of people will say about 5 feet 6 inches. So to have a guy who's over a foot, maybe about 1.5 feet taller than that, is pretty big. Now, I realize that's not this ginormous, towering giant that we tend to assume Goliath was, but almost 7 feet is still a really big dude. He would absolutely be getting signed to the NBA immediately. And the descriptions of the weight of his armor could still be viable for someone who's around 7 feet and maybe has a little bit more of my build, a little bit of a bulkier guy. Now, many of you who have watched our content before know that I lean into a supernatural view of the Bible that assumes the way the authors describe these supernatural events and beings was consistent with their worldview, drawing a lot on the work of Michael Heiser. So I am not entirely opposed to the idea that Goliath could have been the offspring of some semi-supernatural evil entity. There is a whole argument some scholars make that you can look at the Sons of God incident in Genesis 6 and trace the giants in the biblical story to the offspring of those Sons of God. So there would be this weird mixing of divine and human blood. There's a whole lot of weirdness to get into with that. You can check out Michael Heiser's work for more of that. So I'm not opposed to that being an explanation. But if we are just looking at the textual witnesses that we have of these biblical stories, the data seems to lean toward his being about 6 feet 9 inches. Maybe not a giant by our standards, but the text also doesn't call him that. And ultimately, whether he was 6 feet 9 inches or 12 feet or more doesn't really change the meaning of the story. The underdog who believed in Yahweh defeating the big bad guy that didn't. So good Christians can disagree on this. Let's be careful not to write off someone as being a liberal heretic if they think Goliath was a little bit shorter than you do. Ultimately, what matters is the moral of the story that remains the same either way, and that's that God can use anyone to accomplish his purposes, even those that other people might write off as not being the right person for the job. God can use them, and so he can do the same with us.